Now, primarily the Sentry is used for two things in this matchup. Hallucination, usually of a Phoenix to scout with, and for force fields. Force fields are the primary combat function of the Sentry, and can be used to make engagements easily won, which would otherwise normally be lost, as we're going to see here, where the red forces are going to lose an engagement versus some reasonably microed blue stalkers. Now, this fight is pretty much, regardless of how well red micros, never going to go in favor of red without the use of the force field. Even with Guardian Shield to help, it just isn't going to be enough. Stalkers cannot micro it all day long. Now, here you're going to basically want to place your force field exactly on the middle of the ramp, and when the stalkers try to move up, to try to catch some stalkers on the ramp. Now, it's a judgment call when you want to do that, but in this case you do. You want to try to segment some of the stalkers stuck on the ramp where they can't move up because of the zealots, where you can just pick off a few units when they can't micro away to escape. Zealots, if they can attack the stalkers, will slaughter them all day long. As you can see from here, blue basically, no matter how well they micro from this position, is going to have a lot of trouble because the zealots are just going to soak up too much damage. Force fields can be used in other engagements in this matchup to segment enemy army units, like we'll show you a little bit later in PvZ. And can also be used to trap enemy units in cones, and so on and so forth. Sentries are a lifesaver. So here we're going to watch another engagement, which consists of a reasonably okay early game composition from Red Protoss, that is to say Immortal Sentry Zealot, and a bunch of Blink Stalkers. Now, without using the Sentry spells, there's basically no way in hell Red wins this engagement with any micro from Blue, as you're going to see here. There's simply too many stalkers, they can micro too well, you blink around, the zealots can never fight, the sentries don't do enough damage, and if you pick the immortals off fast enough, they can't do the damage they need to do, and blue just straight up wins this. This is a cute micro trick from him moving around the wall, but it's really not even necessary. Now we're going to go ahead and look at this again in a moment here. And we're going to see what happens when you make use of Guardian Shield to greatly reduce the damage of the stalkers, which is extremely important if you have sentries. Guardian Shield is one of the best spells in the game in large engagements, and is great even in small and middling engagements. We're also going to use some Force Field a little bit to kind of prevent the Stalkers from moving around, but it's less important in this particular type of engagement than the Guardian Shield. The Force Field here is basically meant to keep them still so the Zealots can get some hits in, which does indeed add up. Now, the Immortal gets picked off fairly quickly, but because of the Guardian Shield, they got off a few extra shots. The Zealots got a few extra hits in because of the force fields, and it's going to wind up being the case that the Zealots can soak enough damage that the Sentries can simply just finish them off. Guardian Shield is extremely important to use in any fight where there's even a decent amount of range damage incoming. So you almost always, in any fight in this entire matchup, want to have at least one Sentry around for Guardian Shield, especially later on when there are Colossus running around. So here we're going to look at the use of Hallucination as an engagement tool. Now we're going to show you the power of Hallucination by itself to show you why Guardian Shield and Force Field is a better use of energy. Now Force Field, or rather Hallucination, can be very useful for distracting the enemies and forcing them to attack wrong units. As you saw, they attacked the wrong Immortal there. But it's also guesswork and it's luck-based because they can still guess correctly. As you see here, they do pick off the two correct Immortals purely by chance, and do go on to win this fight, although it is still a bit closer than it was without any spells whatsoever. Regardless, Hallucination could have won this fight, but it's risky. It's almost always better to go for the sure thing with Force Fields and Guardian Shield. They are simply more powerful spells in this context. And as before, Hallucination to spawn Phoenixes to scout around the map can be very, very useful in any matchup, but especially PvP, when you are not going for observers early on. Here we're going to show a large-style engagement, the type of thing you'll see later on. It's worth to note, as will be pointed out in a moment here, that the blue army is more expensive and will almost always win this fight between these two unit engagements. There's hardly anything red can do to win this. However, the use of the Sentry spells can make this fight, which would be horribly lopsided, as you're going to see here in a moment, be far more in red's favor than it should be. We're going to go ahead and watch this again. Sentry spells, watch out carefully for how they're used, can make a huge difference. It's worth noting Force Field here is not nearly as useful as Hallucination and Guardian Shield are, because there are Archons for blue, which can crush the Force Fields and make them practically useless. As we can see in this context, the hallucinations for red soaked up the first few shots of the Tempests, allowing the Colossi to get off a lot more attacks than they otherwise would have. The hallucinations of the Zealots also soaked up a lot of Archon and Immortal shots, allowing the Red Army to do a lot more damage. Blue still wins this fight, as Red simply had nothing to attack the Tempests at all except a few Stalkers, but it is much closer, and Blue is left with only one Immortal instead of the large ground army you saw before.